Hi, good morning, everybody. This is Joy from Strong Hearted Native Women's Coalition. I want to welcome you to week 5. This is Rain McNeill. He is presenting to us today on ACEs and childhood exposure. Rain is an ASW CDVA and is the project coordinator for the Domestic Violence Prevention Initiative at the California Rural Indian Health Board. It's a position he has held since 2017. His work is aimed at reducing intimate partner violence, sexual assault, and promoting the development and implementation of evidence-based and practice-based models of domestic violence prevention. Rain holds master's degrees in social work and therapeutic recreation administration and a Bachelor of Science in sociology. For 20 years, Rain has worked in clinical social work, education, child abuse, and substance abuse. Most of his work was in child welfare and child protective services. He is currently an associate social worker within the state of California. Rain is a frequent regional and national presenter and workshop leader focused on creating safe and exclusive communities. He is a part of several organizations and entities aimed at violence prevention, such as NICWA, Red Women Rising, MMIW, and the Interagency Prevention Advisory Council. Rain is originally from North Carolina and is a wartime Navy veteran. So on behalf of Strong Hearted, Rain, I welcome you and thank you for your time and your presentation. There will be, this is being recorded, and at the end, or if you have questions, you can type them in throughout. I'll be monitoring chats. I have Linda Swartz assisting me with that. And we're gonna let you go ahead and get started. Thank you, Rain.
Well, thank you. Welcome everybody again. Very glad for the invitation. Actually, today we're going to be talking about child abuse and its effects on early childhood development. So, can anyone see my screen? I don't know if we have it pulled up the right way.
I can see your screen, Rain. It's your PowerPoint.
Okay, perfect. So, again, today we're going to be talking about domestic violence and its impact on early childhood development. Some of the things that we'll go over are going to be pretty hard, and so I want to make sure that we all acknowledge. Joe, is there any way I can get rid of that without like logging out?
What are you wanting to get rid of, Rain?
Can everyone see my on-air screen and all that stuff, or just the PowerPoint?
Well, we can see, I can see the slides to the left of it. I think you would have to make it a full screen in order for that to go away. But I see you on the top, and then your PowerPoint is right beneath you.
Okay, so we'll just go how we're going. I don't know if people.
Are you wanting to enlarge your screen?
No, I'm wanting. I don't know if everyone can see the go to webinar bracket.
Oh no, sir. All we see is your PowerPoint.
Oh, beautiful. Okay, so sorry for that. I just wanted to make sure no one could see all that stuff on the side of the screen. Okay, so we're not going to do introductions. Hopefully everyone kind of knows everyone. I know a lot of the people who attend these. I see their faces in a lot of conferences and meetings that I go to. We're going to talk about what is DV, its impact on babies and children, warning signs. We'll talk about what babies need, and maybe we'll get into reporting if we have enough time. That's kind of our loose agenda for today. We won't do this, but I always encourage people at trainings that I do to make a human connection and talk to someone you don't know. A lot of times at trainings, we tend to sit next to people we know, and have that connection. But I encourage people to also, when you have a chance, turn to a neighbor. When we have a chance, turn to a neighbor. Okay, what is domestic violence? I think Mike went over this in his webinar the other day, which was fantastic. And his definition is pretty much spot on with what we use. It's a pattern of behavior, abusive behavior, in any relationship that is used by one partner to gain or maintain power and control over an intimate partner. And so when we speak of domestic violence, we usually mean couples, couples of all varieties, but we're speaking mostly in terms of couples. But again, what is it? You know, we say that, but what is domestic violence? And we break that down into 5 different categories: physical, sexual, emotional, financial, and spiritual, or threats of actions that influence another person. So these are the 5 sort of general ways in which domestic violence is visited on a victim. We know what physical is, we know what sexual is. Emotional is, emotional, I'll talk in terms of when I was working for Child Welfare Services. That was one of the hardest allegations to prove, simply because you had to show that the emotional abuse was tied to the action or reaction of the victim. And so that was really a gray area. And the same thing goes on with domestic violence. You know, we call some things emotional abuse outright because of what they are, but that is a very nuanced form of abuse that can manifest in so many different sort of ways that from the outside, it may not look like abuse. It may not look controlling. It may not look detrimental to the person that it's being done to, but it absolutely is. Financial abuse obviously is the taking control of one's finances and controlling them through the control of the money. And we see that a lot in married couples that experience domestic violence, especially. Spiritual abuse is something that we don't talk a lot about, but it absolutely is huge, especially in our Native communities where we know spirituality is such a big part of who we are. And so that is getting a little bit more attention than it had previously, and good for that piece. But those are the 5 that we normally talk about when we talk about forms of domestic violence. And so what does that look like to the victim? Well, if you look at it in a vacuum, so to speak, you have the victim of domestic violence in the middle. Now, the thing I want you to pay attention to with this graphic, and social workers, we love graphics, so we had to have some graphics today. So the domestic violence survivor victim is in the middle, and you have these different forms of abuse going on. So can I have physical abuse happen in the relationship without some emotional abuse happen? Probably not. Can I have sexual abuse and physical abuse be separate? Probably not, because to sexually abuse someone, you have to physically abuse them. So what I want you to pay attention to here is that most of these don't occur singularly. They happen in conjunction with several of the other forms of abuse. And so that's huge, because it's not just one form of trauma happening in the relationship. There can be several different forms of trauma. And so when we start talking about children, Native children specifically, our core statistics show that children are present during domestic violence or intimate partner violence incidents in 45% of the cases. Of those cases where children were present, 60% witnessed the violence. So as someone who's worked in child welfare and who now does domestic violence work, one of the hardest things for me to listen to are or have been parents who justified the children being in the home while they were incredibly violent with each other. The sort of notion that, oh, I put them in the room, they didn't hear anything. I've heard multiple times throughout my career, and parents who just honestly do not understand the connection between witnessing violence and what it does to their children. And so a lot of the justifications I've heard through the years around this have been incredibly irresponsible. And so 45% of those cases, children are actually violent. So 50% of the time, we have children involved in domestic violence cases. As someone who worked in child welfare again for so long, I would put that number higher, just direct experience of what I saw. Children often play a vital role in the abuser's manipulation of the victim. And so we would see, I think, much higher rates in child welfare than 45%. Okay, 40 to 60% of the perpetrators of intimate partner violence also abuse the children. So if you're a victim of domestic violence and you have children, there's a 50-50 chance that he or she is going to go after the children at some point. And that's very impactful. Now, one of the things we didn't talk about earlier in the presentation is that these numbers are all going to be higher for our native population. So when you see 40 to 60%, you want to make sure that you're thinking at the higher end of that range when we're talking about native populations. Boys who witness domestic violence are twice as likely to abuse their own partners and the children when they become adults. So some of this is just really self-explanatory. I'm just trying to give you the impact of what domestic violence does to children across the board. So we're talking about witnessing, we're talking about experiencing, we're talking about being a part of that altercation oftentimes. Males exposed to domestic violence as children are more likely to engage in domestic violence as adults, and females are more likely to be victims as adults. If you've sat in any of my trainings, you've seen this slide and you've heard me say this over and over and over again. Now, one of the things I want everyone to pay attention to is that this is a totally preventable pandemic of abuse that's going on. So we know Native women, we know Natives in general suffer more domestic violence than just about any other population. African American, Latino, Asian American, they're at the top of that abuse scale. But what we know from research and data is that domestic violence is totally preventable. No one is genetically born predisposed to be an abuser. No one is born with a gene that says, I am more likely to be someone who is violent. Domestic violence is a completely 100% learned behavior. So knowing that about domestic violence, that it is 100% preventable. And so that's something I want everyone to focus on, is that it is a very preventable situation when we talk about domestic violence. No one is born an abuser. That is behavior that they learn by witnessing it as children, and that behavior being reaffirmed as they get older, as toddlers, grade school, teenagers. Compared with children in other households, children who've been exposed to domestic violence often suffer from insomnia and have trouble bedwetting. They're often more likely to experience difficulties in school, to score lower on assessments, verbal, motor, cognitive skills, and are more likely to exhibit aggressive and antisocial behavior, to be depressed and to be anxious, and to be slower in cognitive development. So what this research says is, if a child is in a home where there's domestic violence, they're not sleeping, they have incontinence, they have delayed or sort of slowed verbal, motor, cognitive skills, all of these things directly related to domestic violence. So we look at that and we say, well, how does this affect a child's performance in, say, school? Well, if the child's in school and they know they have to go home to the abuser every day and they have to sort of, survive, what do you think that's going to how do you think that would affect their performance in school? Well, if I know I have to figure out how I'm going to survive from 3:30 in the afternoon until 7:30 in the morning when I get back to school, I really don't care what my math homework looks like. I'm really not concerned with the the spelling test that's going to happen. I am more concerned with survival. I am more concerned with my brother or my little sister's survival. I'm really concerned about my mother's survival. And so we absolutely see a drop in performance socially and in education when we're talking about victims of domestic violence who have children and the effects of that on the children. Children absolutely suffer when this is going on. And the data is inconclusive, of course. Conclusive that we have a direct link between violence and lower performance across many different levels for children. Children who are exposed to violence in their homes are 20 times more likely to be physically or sexually assaulted than the national average. So again, pretty self-explanatory. 20 times more likely to be physically and or sexually assaulted Now, again, this number is going to be higher for our Native women and our Native children. The single best predictor of children becoming either perpetrators or victims later in life is whether or not they grew up in a home where that was going on. Study after study shows us that little boys who witness their fathers being aggressive towards their intimate partners grow up and become aggressive towards their intimate partners. Study after study shows us women who are victims of domestic violence almost always witness domestic violence relationships as babies, as toddlers, as children that their mothers were in and saw the abuse their mothers lived through. Children exposed to domestic violence at infancy often experience an inability to bond or form secure attachments. So we're talking about reactive attachment disorders. We're talking about children who have severe attachment disorders where they really are fearful to leave the side of a parent, oftentimes their mother. And so these are the kids that when you drop off from daycare the first day, it sounds like, there's something really wrong with that child. We look at that and say, oh, what is going on? But really, a lot of times that is a direct reflection of the violence that the child has experienced. I'm not saying that every child that gets dropped off and has a problem at daycare has experienced domestic violence, but when I, as a clinician, see those children are often in that sort of clinginess and that death grip that they'll have on a parent, it often reminds me of this particular information. They have very startle reactions. These are babies and children that startle really, really easily. Any loud noise will send them running to a parent or send them running to their room or hiding under a bed. They also have a real inhibited sense of exploration and play. These aren't kids who are going to climb trees and do that kind of stuff. They're going to stay really close to parents. They're going to stay really close to things that they think are safe. And so they won't have the same inhibitions as other children. They won't have that same want and need to explore and play with other kids. They're going to want to stay where they know it's safe. Okay, I'm throwing a lot of hot and heavy stuff at you guys. So if we can, I just want to take a few seconds and have everyone take some breaths, some deep breaths, close their eyes and just kind of center themselves. Just a few breaths to just kind of work through some of this stuff. I throw a lot of hard data and like hard subjects at people a lot of times in these trainings, and so sometimes it's good to just have a little breathing moment and say, let's just center ourselves a little bit. And again, I encourage anyone who has any type of trauma, unresolved trauma that this may trigger, please seek a conversation with someone who you think can help. Don't go through this by yourself and survive it. And so, okay, we got our breaths in. Everyone's kind of calm and centered. Let's jump back in, if we will, and just kind of see where this goes. Okay, what are the effects on infants who witness domestic violence? They cry and scream. They have digestive problems often. Failure to thrive is something that you hear a lot in child welfare. For all intents and purposes, we have a healthy baby. It was born healthy. And 6-7 weeks down the line, it hasn't gained any weight. It has eating issues, illness issues, low weight. It's lost weight, it hasn't gained weight. In child welfare, we call that a failure to thrive. And it can be from any number of reasons, but often we see that when there's violence in the home, the child just doesn't have the same energy and sort of growth that it would if there was no violence. Feeding and sleeping routines are disrupted. Frequent illness, irritability, sadness, anxiety. I don't know how you can measure anxiety in an infant. That's a tough one. Low weight, need for attachment is disrupted. Again, the baby doesn't necessarily bond with the mother or the father or anyone else. No appetite, sleeping problems, and startles easy. So these are all things that in and of themselves you could look at and say, well, my baby had that, but there was no domestic violence. Absolutely. What we're saying is these are some of the effects that you'll often see with infants who are in homes with domestic violence happening. Okay. Effects on witnessing toddlers. Now, if you've worked with me or if you've seen me, you'll recognize this little baby in the corner. That's my daughter. When she was about, I don't know, 8 or 9 months, she hated taking baths, and she had the longest, wildest hair, but that's the stink face I would get every time we put her in the bathtub. And she did not like it at all. So, okay, so effects on toddlers. She was a toddler at the time, which is why the picture is there. Effects on witnessing toddlers, insomnias, parasomnias. For those of you who don't know what insomnia, parasomnia are, insomnia is inability to sleep, basically. Parasomnias are some of the conditions that people have who have trauma that happen while they're sleeping. So there are 2 different types of paratraumas. There's non-REM paratrauma, which means that the insomnia is happening while the person is not in a deep sleep. And then there is the REM parasomnia, which means that it's happening while they're sleeping. Now, the non-REM parasomnia is things like the person will sleepwalk, or they'll yell out and have night terrors. And so those are non-REM parasomnias. Sleepwalking is a big one. Eating, doing things like they wouldn't recognize they did are the non-REM parasomnias. The REM parasomnias would include movements and behaviors while you're sleeping in such a deep sleep that you don't know you're doing them, that you hurt yourself. And so a lot of times people who have the REM parasomnia sleep so deeply that they might hit themselves, might hit their head on the bookshelf, or might fall out of bed and injure themselves. And so they oftentimes will wear safety protection while sleeping. And so those are all effects that we see when it comes to toddlers witnessing domestic violence that they have while sleeping. Lack of feeling of safety, regressive behaviors. These are children who may have been potty trained, but all of a sudden begin wetting themselves, or not telling you that they need to use the restroom, or hiding when they need to go to the restroom. Those are what we call regressive behaviors. The child may not have wanted or had a bottle, but now is asking for a bottle. We go back to the separation and stranger anxiety. These are children who are going to be really, really clingy to non-offending parents. They're going to have severe anxiety and distrust of strangers. We see, again, with the attachment piece, they'll have a really inappropriate attachment to a total stranger, where they'll go to a stranger, they'll walk off with a stranger, and so we see both when we're talking about stranger anxiety. Okay, again, this is my little toddler. We were in, I don't know if you guys are familiar with the Bay Area, but we were at a restaurant that only served macaroni and cheese. That's the only dish on the menu. And so we went to this particular restaurant, and she loves, obviously, spaghetti noodles. So this was her in a better mood. Okay, preschool and kindergarten children do not understand the meaning of abuse and may not believe, or may believe that they did something wrong. The self-blame may cause the child to feel guilt, worry, and anxiety. So what this is basically saying is that younger children don't have the ability to explain their emotions like we do as adults. Even though we oftentimes say to them, use your words, they don't necessarily have the vocabulary to say, Daddy, when you hit mommy, it makes me feel anxious, or it makes me feel like I'm to blame. And so they'll often manifest those emotions that they can't explain into behaviors that we think are troubling, or are something new, or something inappropriate that they shouldn't be doing. And a lot of times that is a clear reaction to their inability to use their words to explain those emotions that they're feeling. Okay, they may become withdrawn, nonverbal, or have regressed behaviors like we just talked about, clinging and whining. Other common behaviors for a child being a victim of domestic violence are eating and sleeping difficulty, and concentration problems. Now, this young man in the corner is my son. He is the king of concentration problems. And it has nothing to do with domestic violence. He just cannot concentrate most days. But we see with children who are living in homes with domestic violence that a lot of times their behavior will change. They will become nonverbal after previously having excellent vocabulary. They become clingy and whining when before they may have been a little more independent, more exploratory in their behavior. Sleeping difficulty is such a big one. These children cannot sleep because they're in constant terror that something is going to happen to them, something's going to happen to a sibling, and something is going to happen to their parent. And so sleeping for them is one of the first things that happens. That sleep is disrupted by the feelings of anxiety and terror that they're going through. Okay, preschoolers living with violence internalize the learned gender roles. So again, we are teaching this child. This child did not show up at the hospital with a genetic code that says you're going to be a victim or you're going to be an abuser. That child watched those gender roles happen in their home repeatedly. They watched the victimization. So seeing males perpetrators and females as victims. That child is learning that behavior. Mommy is always a victim. Daddy is always angry. Daddy is always aggressive. Daddy is always violent. She or he is learning that behavior. As a preschooler, imitated learned behaviors of intimidation and abuse. Again, even in preschool, as early as preschool, the child is going to lock on and sort of log in those role modelings. Girls are victims, boys are victimizers, boys are aggressive. And we as a society do a good job of teaching those behaviors. You know, girls are always having to be saved, you know, the damsel in distress, the big strapping masculine guy comes riding in on a horse. So not only is the child who's the victim of domestic violence getting that message from home and the interactions that she's seeing or he is seeing from the parenting, including boyfriends and, you know, just people in the home, they're also getting it from society as a whole. You know, the preschooler may be present with aggressive behavior, lashing out, defensive behavior, or extreme separation anxiety from the primary caregiver. So the child is seeing all of this. And with that, the lessons that the child is learning are so much more extreme because we're talking about survivability. It's one thing when I put my son down and say, hey, I need you to read this book to me, and he learns that behavior. It's something totally different when a child is faced with the reality that you have to survive this. So these are the behaviors you have to learn in order to exist, in order to survive. You have to do these things. And so the child learns that from the mother in very extreme lessons. The lessons aren't a normal lesson that you would give to a child. These are extreme lessons where the child watches the parent or the victim be beaten, bruised, sometimes sexually abused in front of the child. And so those are lessons that are really hard to break, and they come on board to the child really, really early in the relationship with the parents. Children who witness domestic violence often experience many of the same symptoms and effects as a child who's victim of domestic violence themselves, including post-traumatic stress disorder. So what we're saying is children who experience violence physically firsthand versus those who may witness it, they have the same symptoms, they have the same effects. And post-traumatic distress disorder is big because what that we see that a lot of is in our wartime veterans, people who have gone to war, people who have seen war up close and personal, bombs, explosions, maimed bodies, death all around them, danger all around them. And what we're saying is that these children have the same experiences. For a child living in a home with domestic violence, you could equate that to being in Iraq as a soldier. Absolutely. And so what we see are some of the same mental health disorders that our soldiers have, our young children have also. And I think there's a graphic somewhere that speaks to Native American children suffer this at extremely higher rates than other children. So when we're talking about PTSD and Native children, again, we're talking about a much more higher number. Okay, potential effects on children who witness violence. Again, I'm just trying to reiterate some of the things that I've talked about in the earlier slides. So infants, the need for attachment is disrupted. The child may not attach to the mother or the father. and seem distant or seem like they don't necessarily bond to anyone. But you'll also have children who later on that need for attachment that's disrupted will manifest in other ways. Poor sleeping habits. Again, hard for a baby to sleep when it's scared all the time, and it hears loud screaming, it hears banging, it hears all those things, it hears its primary caregiver crying. It's really hard for an infant to sleep when all that's going on. Eating problems. Yes, the baby's going to have eating problems. The baby may um, have extreme eating problems. Higher risk of physical injury. Yes. Working in child welfare, oftentimes the children would be included in the altercation. Um, the father would try to take the baby from the mother's arms, or the mother would, I hate to say it this way, try to shield herself with the baby. We had several incidents where that happened and the baby was harmed. Or maybe a lot of times the father is trying to hurt the baby and the mother is protecting the baby. And so in doing that, the altercation, the baby gets harmed because the mother is shielding the baby and maybe falls or hits something. So we saw a lot of that happen too. We're talking about infants and domestic violence. Preschool lacks feeling of safety. Um, Again, no child is going to feel safe when there's a domestic violence relationship going on in the home that they live in. They're going to have extreme separation and stranger anxiety. These are going to be kids, again, who are going to run away from strangers, or they may inappropriately bond to a stranger again and feel a connection to that stranger. They'll have regressive behaviors again. They'll go back to bedwetting. They may have previously not been a bedwetter, but the violence reaches a point that it triggers that regressive behavior. Parasomnias and insomnias we talked about. For school-age children, this is where you start to see a lot of the self-blame. Like they begin to explore those words that they previously didn't have in their vocabulary and a way to kind of connect the dots. Well, the school-age children begin to connect those dots. They begin to wonder, am I the reason for the violence? Am I the reason for the trauma going on? Am I the reason for daddy being angry all the time because I didn't do my homework or because, I didn't, take out the garbage, those kind of little things. Somatic complaints, aggressive behaviors, regressive behaviors. Again, this is where your kids begin, especially, our Native children, our African American children, our Latino children begin to be labeled aggressive, and those sort of things. They start to become more, you'll see them become put in detention more often. They become expelled more often because the behaviors are such that the school wants to say, well, whatever it is, they can't have it here at school instead of addressing what is going on. So you see the children start to become labeled at this point as problem children, as children who need, special classes, IEPs, all those sort of things start to become issues for the parent. Adolescence, school truancy begins to happen. These are the kids who will start to skip school. Again, they're trying to find safety. They're trying to find acceptance. They're trying to find ways in which, what they're doing with at home that they can work out. And oftentimes they find that in skipping school, hanging out with people. You'll see this a lot of gang activity begins at this age. Delinquency, they begin to engage in criminal behavior. Substance abuse. This is where our children begin, and our Native children especially begin to explore substance abuse, to begin to experiment with different drugs. Early sexual activity. Again, our children begin to explore sexually because there's no one home. There's no one watching the home because mom is trying to survive, or if it's the case where dad is trying to survive, whatever the situation may be, no one's paying attention to the needs of the children. And in long-term domestic violence relationships, a lot of these are going to be skewed with school-age children. We'll have school-age children who are using alcohol. We'll have school-age children who are skipping school or being delinquent and engaging in criminal behavior. So when we're talking long-term, you have to fast forward these a little bit because these children, by the time they're adolescents, have done a lot of the things on the list for adolescents simply because there was no oversight or appropriate parenting going on. Okay, children need a safe and secure home environment. Every child has the right to grow up safe from harm and should feel that those that love are also protected. So what children need is they need to grow up feeling loved, and they need to know that their loved ones, the people that they care about, are safe and loved as well. It's not just enough for you to say to your child, I love you and I want the best for you, and then that child watch you be abused. And so we have to really make sure that the child not only sees the love from parents and from those around them that they love, but they also know that those around them are safe and protected. Violence in the home shatters a child's basic right to feel safe and secure in the world. Absolutely. So I'll say that one more time. Violence in the home shatters a child's basic right to feel safe and secure in the world. Okay, so this is my daughter again. This is at Ocean Beach. If any of you ever get the chance to visit Ocean Beach in San Francisco, I highly encourage it. It is just one beautiful long stretch of sandy beach in the middle of the city. So what do they need? Children need a sense of routine and normalcy. Violence in the home can turn a child's world upside down. Routines such as going to school and participating in recreational activities are vital for a child's development and well-being. Absolutely. Routine is one of the best things you can do for a child, especially if that routine is positive. And so one of the things that violence does in a child's home is it destroys any routine. The routine is the cycle of violence that happens, the explosion, the calm down, the build up, the explosion. We've all seen the violent cycle. So that's the normalcy that the child has, and that doesn't really have a pattern or a beat to it versus like school or recreational activities like sports. And so it's really important that you have those things in place for children. It's really beneficial to them, and that you do all you can to remove violence from the equation. And routine is just one of those things that children absolutely benefit from. So this is me, and this is me and my little guys' routine. And what we do is every Friday after Daddy's done working is we get to have they're called Otter Pops, but my kids couldn't say Otter Pops when we started doing this, so they call them Poppy Doos. So these are Friday afternoon Poppy Doos that are our routine that we do. Children need to know that they're adults who will listen, believe, and shelter them. Most children will go through life knowing that their parents are these adults, but a lot of children will not. And so we need to understand that, and we need to address that. Adults who work with Native children, especially including teachers, social workers, relatives, and parents themselves, need the awareness and the skills to recognize and meet the needs of children exposed to domestic violence in the home and revert them to appropriate services and do the sort of things that need to be done to protect our children. Because again, this is learned behavior. If we can interrupt that learning process in violence and the nature of violence in relationships, we can interrupt the pattern of behavior. We can break the cycle, so to speak. And that's huge. This is something that's not like cancer or diabetes or say AIDS research. We know what we can do to break the cycle of violence in our Native communities, in our other communities. It's very simple. If we can stop exposing the children to violence and expose them to appropriate positive relationships. Now, again, I want to preface that with there are always going to be a certain portion of the world that is going to be violent and aggressive. But those numbers that what we have today compared to what they could look like with prevention would be incredible. So children need support services to meet their needs. Responses to Native children exposed to domestic violence should be comprehensive, but also holistic and spiritual in nature, taking into account the range of effects and needs of children, of different children, especially those of Native heritage. Native children have very specific needs. They have very specific and varied sort of approaches to the way they live their life, and the way we approach Native children and how we help them through domestic violence should be just as comprehensive. It shouldn't be a one-size-fits-all sort of model. It should be very specific to the needs of those particular Native children. And so one of the things I'll point out is in California alone, we have over 115, I think currently 115 recognized federal tribes, and many more that aren't recognized. We often talk in terms of Native peoples and Native communities, not paying tribute or respect or deference to the fact that those were all independent, sort of own micro cultures that existed. They don't share similar languages a lot. A lot of them don't share similar cultural sort of values and traditions. And so their histories are just as different as the responses that we would need to address their children. Children in Northern California who grew up close to the coast are going to have different needs and sort of approaches to things versus children who grew up in the sort of semi-arid deserts in San Diego. So we have to sort of look at the different needs of our children and not sort of get lost in the all Native children need this or all Natives should be doing this. It's a very complicated and layered issue, and I don't want to lose out or lose any attention to the fact that these are so many different microcultures that existed. Okay, this was 1-year-old Kaya at her birthday party. You can't see the folks, but it was just basically her and all her aunts and uncles and her parents. We didn't know what to do for a 1-year-old birthday party because she didn't know anybody. So she got a big old cake and the chance to do her thing. Okay, children need to learn that domestic violence is wrong and learn nonviolent methods to resolving conflict. Because here's what we know. We teach children how to resolve conflict by them watching us. So if I grow up in a home with domestic violence, I assume violence is how I solve most of my problems because I watched my dad solve most of my problems, or my mom solve most of her problems by being violent. And so that is a lesson that needs to be unlearned or broken or just never ever taught. And Native children must hear it reaffirmed and modeled that domestic violence is wrong. They have to see alternative role models in order to grow up with a positive idea of the future. A lot of times I hear survivors of domestic violence talk about how easily accepted it was in her or his community or world that there was domestic violence going on, and that it was just so accepted by the community at large, and people wouldn't talk about it, and oftentimes the victims were blamed. And so Native children never ever need to hear that that is something going on. We need to show and model for our Native children that our intimate partners are valued, we respect relationships, and that we do things to lift up our partners and not tear them down, not hurt them, and not teach that to the next generation of our young people. And so, again, we can clearly break this cycle. We know the data reaffirms that we can break the cycle. We just have to figure out how do we get from that data point to positive action in our communities where it's not okay to batter victims and abuse our intimate partners, and do it while our children are present. So if you know me, you know this is the logo that we used last year for our domestic violence program, and it still stands true today. Hands are not for hitting. And so with that, I don't think I have anything else on these slides. Yep, I think that's it. Again, here's my daughter being totally inappropriate, but I hope this sort of lightens what we talked about here. And I think at this point, we can take any questions.
Okay, so what I'm going to do, Rain, is the same thing I did last time, unmute everyone so that they can ask their questions. Okay, so y'all are unmuted. If you have any questions, now's the time to ask. Well, it looks like you must have covered it quite well, Rain.
Oh yeah, I know there are questions, but it is Friday,
Yeah,
and so I know people have a lot of stuff going on. Um, I just hope this was informative and that people got something from it.
it is. And what we'll do is we'll do the same thing as we did on Wednesday. We'll stop the recording here for a second and give people an opportunity to ask off the record.